Everyone relax, take a deep breath. It's just another mid-year freakout. Welcome to the depths. Hello, welcome to Reading from the Depths. My name is Lectin. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today, I decided to do the mid-year freakout tag. Now, I wasn't actually tagged by anyone. My channel is quite new, so I don't get any tags yet. But this tag has been going around, as it does every June, July, and I thought it would be fun to be part of it. I've seen a number different versions of this tag going around with a different number of questions. So the version I'm doing has 13 questions. If you know of other questions that you've seen that you want me to answer, go ahead and put them down in the comments and I'll do my best to answer them. So for this tag, I'm only going to discuss books I read through June. So I read about 90 books through June, even though it's July as I film this. I'm a little late to the party. That's okay. I am including books that have not been published yet, but I read early as advanced reader copies. So even though those come after June, since I read them in 2024 between January and June, I'm going to include them. Okay? So let's get started. First question is, what is the best book you've read so far in 2024? So it starts with a bang, right? You know, it's really hard for me to say one book is better than another that I've read. I had a lot of books that I read this year that I've enjoyed a lot so far. For me, I think I'm going to have to say The Angel of Indian Lake by Stephen Graham Jones, which is the final book in his trilogy, in the Indian Lake trilogy. First, you had My Heart is a Chainsaw, and then Don't Fear the Reaper, and now finally Angel of Indian Lake. And I don't know if I wouldn't say that it's objectively the best book I've read, but it feels like the best book I read. And I think that's in large part because it was the end of this trilogy and it did such a great job of being a standalone book on its own, but also wrapping up the events of the trilogy in like a really meaningful way. And it tied all three books together in a way that not all trilogies do successfully. So because I thought it was a great book, I enjoyed every moment of it. There were some scenes that were incredibly cinematic and just had me like grinning from ear to ear. And it also did a good job of wrapping up the whole trilogy. So for that reason, I think the book that feels like my favorite book so far of 2024, at least as of, today, is going to be The Angel of Indian Lake by Stephen Graham Jones. So what is the best sequel you've read so far in 2024? Well, I could answer the same thing, The Angel of Indian Lake, as it is the final book in a trilogy. But if I want to switch it up, I'm going to say The Devil by Name by Keith Rawson. Now, this is a book that hasn't been released yet. It's going to be released a little bit later in the year, and I'm going to do a full review of it when it gets closer to the release date. This is a sequel to Fever House, and it's a duology. So I don't think there'll be any more books in the series. And what to say about these books? These books are like driving 100 miles per hour down the highway blindfolded. Like once they start, they don't stop. Even to try to explain them, it would take a long time. But in short, there are these relics that may or may not be from the devil. And when you have proximity to them, it causes you to get intense bloodlust and go crazy. They include the voice and the hand and the eye of the devil, supposedly. And there are secret government agencies that are trying to weaponize them and use them. And then there's individuals who are just searching for their own power. And then there are people trying to stop them. And it's all these different forces working together. And this kind of occult, supernatural, really balls to the wall, action filled story. So it's a lot of fun. I will leave a more extensive review closer to the time of publication. But so The Devil by Name, I think, is going to be my best sequel of the year so far. What is a new release that you want to have read but haven't yet? So a book that's already been released in 2024, but I haven't got a chance to read yet. If I had done this video a few days ago, I would have said Bury Your Gaze by Chuck Tingle. That came out in early July. And I haven't read it yet, but I have started reading it. So it's right on the border. So instead, I'm going to say Mirrored Heavens by Rebecca Roanhorse. Now, Mirrored Heavens is the last book in a trilogy in the Between the Earth and Sky trilogy. The first two books are Black Sun and Fevered Star. And these are these kind of high epic fantasies that have really, really interesting political and social intrigue and a really compelling kind of magic system for what it is. The setting is inspired by a number of different indigenous communities. Rebecca Roanhorse herself is an indigenous author, and they're just really exciting books. So I'm really looking forward to reading the third one. I will say the books are quite epic. There's a lot of different characters and a lot of things happening. And I actually the last one was published, I think, 2 years ago. So I need to go back and review a little bit before I read the third one because I don't remember exactly where things stand. That's part of the problem when you have books that are so epic and huge and they are a couple years between release dates. But that's my new release that I haven't read yet that I'm looking forward to. I have a copy of it. It's just in the queue. So Mirrored Heavens by Rebecca Roanhorse. What is your most anticipated book for the second half of 2024? I was thinking about this, and most of the books that I was really looking forward to this year have already come out. So there aren't a lot in the back half of 2024 that I know about. I'm sure there are a lot. I'm just not clued into them. But the one I've been thinking of a lot is Absolution by Jeff Vandermeer. So Jeff Vandermeer is known for his weird fiction and his sci-fi fiction. And the Southern Reach trilogy, also called the Area X trilogy, which was Annihilation, Authority, and Acceptance, were some of my favorite books. I really, really had a great time with them. And this is actually a sequel to that. So it's no longer going to be a trilogy. It's set 4 years after the last book of that trilogy. And that comes out later this year. I'm really excited to read it. I will say, I don't have a strong memory of what happens in Authority and Acceptance, the last two books of the trilogy. I remember the vibes of it and the overall feeling, but those books are so weird that I really need to read them again. And so I'm hoping to do a reread of the whole trilogy later in the year before Absolution comes out, and then I can read them all together. I don't know if that's really in the cards, but we're going to try. So my most anticipated book for the second half of 2024 is Absolution by Jeff Vandermeer. Next question is, what is your biggest disappointment of 2024? And I would say I have 3 books to list here. 1 nonfiction and 2 that are fiction. The nonfiction one, actually this is true for all 3 of these books, is that it was really me having high expectations that caused them to be disappointments. So the nonfiction one is called Notes on Complexity, a scientific theory on connection, consciousness, and being by Neil Thies. And Neil Thies is a researcher who does work in complexity theory, which is really interesting. And I heard him on a podcast, and he was so energetic, and the way he spoke about complexity theory and consciousness and spirituality and how they mix together, I thought was really exciting. And so I got a copy of his book, and I was really disappointed. The beginning of his book is like a primer into complexity theory, which I thought was great, was really interesting. But then when he builds off of that, it just felt very hand-wavy. It felt very surface level. It didn't feel like he was going really deep, and it didn't feel like he was creating an argument that could withstand critique or could withstand objection. So it didn't feel like it had substance. And then there's a part where he starts discussing different religious traditions, interpretations of consciousness, and so forth. And he pulls in examples from a couple different spiritual traditions. He addresses them all in his own terms. So it feels like he's almost appropriating these ideas and forcing complexity theory on top of it. And it isn't even compelling the way he does it. So I was really disappointed. But again, that's because I heard him speak and I was really excited about the book based on hearing him talk in this podcast. And it just didn't live up to the hype I had created when I heard him. So that's the first one. And the other 2 are fiction. And again, both of these are good books. I enjoyed them and I would recommend them to people. They just weren't as good as I hoped that they would be. And that's my own fault. So the first one is Last to Leave the Room by Caitlin Starling. And Caitlin Starling has written a number of books, but the one that I had read that I really fell in love with was The Luminous Dead. I thought The Luminous Dead was a great sci-fi book that had me gripped right from the beginning. The setting, the characters, the motivation, everything about it I thought was really, really compelling. I loved it, and I really was looking forward to this book based on my experience with The Luminous Dead. And The Last to Leave the Room is a good book. It just didn't grip me nearly as strongly as The Luminous Dead did. The first half, it takes a while to get moving, and it feels like it stumbles over its own 2 feet for almost the first half of the book. Then when some of the weirder things start happening in a more rapid way, then it gets really interesting. It just took a while, and it didn't take hold of me the way I wanted it to. Again, that's my fault though, not the book's fault. But for that reason, it was a disappointment. And then the second one that was my biggest disappointment so far, I know is going to be controversial because many people really, really love this book. And don't get me wrong, I love this book. I thought it was really good. It just wasn't as good as I hoped it would be. And that is Our Share of Night by Mariana Enriquez. This is a translated novel from Argentinian. And it was good. It was a good book. I'm not saying it wasn't. It had so much hype about it. And so many people whose opinions I usually jive with really, really loved it. And I thought, it was just too long. It was too long, and I love long books. I'm a lifelong fan of Stephen King, so I'm used to a book breaking 1,000 pages. It doesn't bother me. It just felt like it didn't need to be as long as it was, and that length didn't add anything, at least in my reading experience. And so I had these really, really high, almost probably unrealistic expectations, and I didn't meet them. So for that reason, it was a disappointment. Still a really good book. I would still recommend it. And in fact, I have a collection of short stories by Mariana Enriquez that's due to be released later this year. I was given an advanced reader copy, and so I'm really excited to read that and read some other fiction that she's written that isn't quite as long as Our Share of Night and see how that holds up. So it was a good book. Both of them were good books, but they just didn't live up to my expectations, and so for that reason, they were a disappointment of 2024. So the next question flips that and says, what is your biggest surprise of 2024? And for this one, it's going to be another collection of short stories called Bugsy and Other Stories by Raphael Frumkin. And the reason this is a surprise to me is I had never heard of Raphael Frumkin or this book, but it was randomly recommended to me by Libby, when the library app, when I was putting a hold for a different book in the app, and it recommended this book to me based on other books I'd read. And I said, sure, why not? And I put it in my queue. And it is a collection of 5 or 6 stories. They're not quite novellas, not quite short stories, so I guess some people call them novelettes. And the reason it was so surprising to me is a lot of the stories, at least the way they read on the jacket copy, are almost like very emotional and saccharine in nature. And that doesn't always appeal to me. But this is a queer author that supposedly was genre defying, so I thought I'd read it, and it was great. Every story was fun, and the stories, like the jacket copy says, go across all different genres. The first story, the title story, follows a young woman who comes from like a broken and dysfunctional home and who is suffering from like low self-esteem and depression, and then she finds a new family, basically finds like a way to create meaning in her life through sex work and a group of sex workers, and it's unconventional sex work at that. And this is really interesting to see her find this family and to find import in her life. And so that's the first story, and that's how like the collection kicked off. There's also a story from the point of view of maybe 8 or 9-year-old nonverbal autistic child, which is really heartbreaking. The author has a little introduction that explains his own experiences of neurodivergency and the kind of research he did to try to write from the perspective of a nonverbal autistic child, because obviously that isn't his own experience, even if it is parallel to it. So he wrote with quite a lot of sensitivity, and it's just a heartbreaking story. When you see this child doing his best to reach out and engage with the world in the only ways he knows how, and yet his parents refuse, not intentionally, but just due to their kind of small-mindedness and their expectations of normality, whatever that may mean, they aren't able to connect with him in any meaningful way. It's really, really heartbreaking. But other stories are filled with joy and love, and it really was a surprise for me because I had never heard of this author. The book was randomly, I guess not randomly, but algorithmically suggested to me. And just from the jacket copy, I kind of expected it to be too saccharine for my tastes. I didn't think it would, I didn't think I would vibe with it, and it was the exact opposite. So Bugsy and Other Stories by Raphael Frumkin was my biggest surprise of 2024 so far. Favorite new author is the next question, either debut author or new to you. And so for this, I'm going to choose an author that's new to me. I have read a number of debut authors this year, and some of them were really, really good. Blew me away, actually. But the one that kind of was the one that I have to say is my favorite right now is new to me author, and that is Brahm. And the book I read by Brahm is Slewfoot, A Tale of Bewitchery, which is just a really almost classical folk horror story, but it's just done so well, and the main character is so compelling. She's so well-rounded. She knows what she wants, and she addresses all of the difficulties in her situation so well, and the town and the world is just really, really well developed. And on top of it, there's beautiful artwork that's all done by Brahm as well, throughout the book. So it really just, the book won me over so much that I have another book by Brahm that's an advanced reader copy of a story he's releasing later in this year. I'm excited to read that. And I'm excited to go through his back catalog and read some of his other work as well. So my favorite new to me author is Brahm. Then the next question is, what is your newest fictional crush? And, it's not entirely appropriate for me to have crushes as a monk, first off. But even if that wasn't the case, I don't have any recollection of ever having a crush on a fictional character. Maybe that's why I'm a monk. But so I think I'm just going to skip this question. The next question is, what is your new favorite character? So this I can vibe with. My new favorite character, again, comes from a book I didn't expect. It's a novella called A Season of Monstrous Conceptions by Lena Rather. And this was recommended to me again by the Libby algorithm when I was putting a hold on a different book based on other books I'd read. And this is a novella, and it's described as an eldritch historical fantasy filled with midwifery, monstrosity, and the rending of the world. So the main character, Sarah Davis, due to the circumstances of her birth, she's kind of looked down upon and dismissed by normal society, and yet she's doing her best to deal with whatever resources she has, which include a latent magical capacity or ability to practice some sort of magic. And she realizes that everyone in her orbit is either dismissing her right out of hand or trying to exploit her and use her for their own benefit. And she sees that. She also knows that's the only game in town. So she's willing to play along, but she's constantly working for her own means in and around the machinations of others. So I thought she's just really strong. Like, she's just basically a badass. And so Sarah Davis, yeah, definitely. A Season of Monstrous Conceptions. It's a great novella. I highly recommend it. Okay, next question. What is a book that made you cry? Well, I tend to cry easily in when I read stories and movies as well. So there are probably a few I could choose from. There are two. I limited it down to two for this video. The first one would be Sorrowland by River Solomon, and that came out I think in 2021. And the heart of the story is a teenage girl who lives in a kind of fanatical religious cult, and they have a compound, and she's pregnant, and she escapes and flees from the compound because she doesn't want her babies to be born into that cult. And so she escapes into the woods outside of the compound and is constantly being chased by members of the compound. So she gives birth to twin boys by herself in the woods and then tries to raise them and run away from these people that are chasing her. And at the same time, it is a book of magical realism, so there's a supernatural element that like weaves its way in and out of the story. And it's this really heartbreaking but also emboldening and really enriching. And River Solomon, I'd read one other book by them, and just the way they write, the topics they deal with, and the type of kind of magical touch they put into their writing is just really, really wonderful. Exquisite prose, really compelling characters. So Sorrowland, that's one book that made me cry this year. Then another one is a book called Compound Fracture by Andrew Joseph White. And this actually has not been released yet. It's going to be released in a few months, and I will leave a longer review then. But Andrew Joseph White is a trans author. This is his third novel. He writes horror novels, and all three so far have been widely different. The first one, Hell Followed With Us, is a post-apocalyptic body horror that's filled with like religious zealots. And then the second one is The Spirit Bears Its Teeth, is like this Victorian Gothic almost romance where the main character is sent to a school for wayward girls, and there's different types of magic and hauntings happening. And then this one, Compound Fracture, is really about intergenerational feuds and trauma and the relationship between the ruling class and the working class, and about class solidarity. There's also ghosts involved, so there's this kind of like ghostly apparition that comes in and out of the story. And the main character is this trans autistic youth. He's 16, I think, when the story starts. And what I love about the story is that the story, he isn't questioning his transness. He has just started coming out within the time the story begins. So there's still difficulty in that transition and in presenting it to others. But he himself knows who he is. So this isn't a story about self-identity in that way. It's this kind of bloody revenge story trying to right wrongs. So it's really, really compelling. And there is just really wonderful interactions between him and his family, especially at a point, a little bit later in the story when the antagonist tried to use his identity as a trans person against him, and they try to out him in such a way as to cause division amongst his family, among other people that are on his side, trying to, create this movement of class solidarity. And you see people rally together to support him instead of taking the bait and turning against him. And it's just really, really touching and emotional. And so that's another book that made me cry, Compound Fracture, a horror novel by Andrew Joseph White. So then the flip side of a book that made you cry is question number 11. What is a book that made you happy? And so for this book, I think I'm going to choose two, The Book of Queer Saints, Volumes 1 and Volume 2. I've done a review for these on the channel. They are horror anthologies of short stories, of queer horror short stories. And they were just so much fun to read. It was really a celebration of queer love and queer identity and queer joy, but through the lens of queer outrage and queer monstrosity. And I just couldn't help but having a huge grin on my face through every story in both volumes. So the Book of Queer Saints, volumes 1 and volume 2, just made me so happy to read both of them. They're independently published books, and I found them by accident, and I'm so glad I did. So I highly recommend those. I have reviews for them on my channel already. Next, what is the most beautiful book you've bought so far this year or received? And the truth is, I don't own many physical books. Almost all of my books I read are digital. So I don't have a lot to choose from for this, but will say that I supported a number of books this year through Kickstarter, anthologies, and two of those are quite gorgeous. The first one is called Enter Boogeyman, and this is a collection of horror stories centering around the figure or the idea of the boogeyman. And the cover glows in the dark, and the play between black and light is just really, really beautiful, I think. And the second one is a collection of folk horror stories called Folkloric, an anthology of folk tales and horror. And again, just the cover I think is really sumptuous and beautiful. So those are two. And if I had to choose a more conventionally published book, then I would say The Angel of Indian Lake by Stephen Graham Jones. And this cover is really simple, actually. It is not colorful, it is not flashy, but if you look at the three covers of all the books in the trilogy together, I think they work really well together. And by being so simplistic and minimalistic, they really are compelling. They like draw you in. And I think like the theme of something ripping through the cover of all three of them is just really well done. And so the Angel of Indian Lake, I think, is actually a really, really great cover, even though it is so simple. And it's also interesting because Stephen Graham Jones isn't always known for having beautiful covers. And his newest release, because yes, he did release two books in 2024, is called I Was a Teenage Slasher. And I've actually already done a review of this on my channel as well. And the cover for that is not so great at all. But Angel of Indian Lake is quite a beautiful cover, and I'm glad I have a copy of it, of the whole trilogy, actually. And then the last question, Lucky 13, is what book do you need to read before the end of the year? And so, as I mentioned, I want to do a reread of the Southern Reach trilogy before I read Absolution. So that's one series of books I'd like to read. But then a few others that are on my TBR, Nestlings by Nat Cassidy. So I read Mary, which is his previous novel, and I loved it. I thought it was really, really great. And I was looking forward to this when it came out, and I just haven't gotten around to it. I have a copy of it, and it's sitting in my TBR and just not going anywhere. So that's the first one. And then the second one is The Reformatory by Tanari Vidu. And the same thing. This literally hits every single one of my checkboxes. Like it's very firmly in my wheelhouse. And for some reason, I just haven't read it yet. All it's gotten is good reviews. Everyone says it lives up to the hype. It literally has all the things that I want in a horror story, and it's just sitting on top of my TBR, and I haven't gotten to it yet because new books keep showing up, and I keep being attracted to the shiny new thing, and I just haven't gotten a chance to do it. So that is in the top of my pile. I'm definitely going to read those two before the end of the year. Nestlings by Nat Cassidy and The Reformatory by Tanari Vidu. So I think that's it. I've gotten through all 13 questions. Let me know what you think. I'm not going to tag anyone because no one knows who I am yet, so a tag for me doesn't really mean anything. But I will say, if you want to answer these questions, I'd love to read your responses down in the comments. And if you have any thoughts about my responses, whether you agree with them or disagree with them, I'd love to have that conversation down in the comments as well. For now, I'll say thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate you. Be kind to yourselves, take care of each other, and go slowly.